Why did Paul initially refuse to be released from prison in Philippi? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts 16, verses 35 to 40. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 16, verse 35. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 16, beginning at verse 35. And when it was day, the magistrates sent the officer, saying, "Let those men go." So the keeper of the prison reported those words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to you to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace." Paul said to them, "They have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now do they put us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come themselves and get us out." And the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. Then they came and pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to depart from the city. So they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And when they had seen the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. Paul and Silas had been thrown in prison in Philippi on false charges of teaching Romans unlawful things. In actuality, Paul had angered some slave masters by casting out a demon from their slave that they were using as a fortune teller. While in prison, Paul and Silas continued worshiping God, for they trusted in him to accomplish his will no matter what, even if that meant they remained in prison for the time being. At around midnight, though, an earthquake, evidently sent from God, opened the prison doors and loosed the chains of all the prisoners. Everybody could have escaped, but nobody did. This extremely unusual behavior caused the jailer, who was just about to commit suicide, thinking all the prisoners had escaped, to ask Paul and Silas what must he do to be saved. The answer was, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and he would be saved. Now the gospel needed to be preached to this man, which Paul of course did, leading to the man immediately being baptized. Those in his house who heard the message too did the same thing. Following this baptism, the jailer sat down to eat with Paul and Silas, having already washed their stripes, rejoicing that he was now a follower of Jesus, a man whom he never heard of before that day, but a man who would change his life from that moment on. Coming out of verse 35, the setting has shifted to early the next morning. The magistrates that had sent Paul and Silas to prison sent the officers to the prison, saying to let these men go. What changed their mind? Well, we don't know. But what we do know is that Romans often see earthquakes as a message from the gods that they were angry. If these gods had been real, what would they have been angry with? Now, Paul and Silas were beaten and imprisoned without any sort of investigation. It was only on the word of one witness that a prison sentence was handed down. So it could very well have been a guilty conscience. Whatever the case, the magistrates were ready to release Paul and Silas. The problem was, Paul refused to be released. Now you might think, why was Paul making such a fuss? But it was the principle of it. They had been beaten openly. They were thrown in prison uncondemned, something also done publicly. And to boot, the magistrates hadn't even inquired of Paul and Silas anything concerning who they were, for if they had, they would have known that both of them had Roman citizenship. Now, what we need to understand is that Roman citizenship carried with it rights that were to be honored by the rulers, including the right to a fair trial and not to be beaten without cause. Now, we don't know how Paul obtained Roman citizenship yet in Acts, but we will later, so we'll leave that point for now. All we need to know is that Paul and Silas were both Roman citizens. Thus, Paul was going to ensure that these magistrates understood the situation and responded properly, which in this case meant that they needed to be released and exonerated publicly. What Paul is doing is not seeking revenge. I don't believe that he's even wanting these magistrates thrown in prison themselves, for he doesn't report the incident to those higher in authority. Instead, Paul's actions showed that he wanted these magistrates to do their jobs properly. There were now Christians in Philippi who were probably going to ruffle some feathers with the people. If the magistrates continued throwing people in prison for no cause, these Christians could end up suffering simply for being Christians. And while that might happen from time to time, it shouldn't in a society that follows the rule of law, for Christians don't break the laws of men as long as those laws don't force us to break God's law. Christians then shouldn't be a threat to government power, deserving of prison, but should be model citizens. By asserting his rights to be treated humanely by the local authorities and not to be released secretly when the arrest was public, shows us that we can assert our rights that our government gives us under the laws of our land. We cannot break the law in asserting those rights. We cannot rebel against the government in order to assert those rights. And we cannot assert rights that we do not have. But we can assert rights we do have by going through the proper channels, which is what Paul was doing here. Now, when the magistrates heard that Paul and Silas were Romans, they were afraid, for in treating a Roman this way, they opened themselves up for punishment had this been found out by higher authorities. The magistrates pleaded with Paul to come out of the prison, and they asked him to depart from the city so that no further trouble would be had. Paul eventually agreed, but before he left, he went into the house of Lydia to see the brethren and encourage them. We'll see where Paul goes next, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 17, verses 1 to 9, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.